And they found higher productivity in the privatized airports, more airline service, and increased airline competition, which I was surprised. I think a lot of people were probably surprised at hearing that. And a few specific findings, if you average things over the two sets of privatized and non-privatized, the privatized airports had 21% more passengers per flight. I guess upgauging must have taken place at these airports.
Welcome to The Vertical Space, the podcast at the intersection of technology and flight, featuring deep dives with innovators, early adopters, and industry leaders. We are your hosts, Jim Barry from Celerity 05 and Peter Shannon and Luka Tomjanovic from Radius Capital. At Celerity 05, we believe that breakthrough air transportation capabilities come from leveraging current and emerging technologies, and that companies achieve profitability through relevant technologies, strong teams, and a deep understanding of the aviation market. Connect with global aviation experts at celerity05.com for feedback and recommendations to chart your path to success. At Radius Capital, we invest in early-stage deep tech that redefines what is possible in aerospace. We partner with founders building next-generation aerospace capabilities, from advanced design and development tools to the digital transformation of the flight environment, novel use cases and forms of flight, and the software and systems that make them possible. If this describes you, reach out. We're excited to connect. All right, let's dive in.
Hey, welcome back to The Vertical Space and a conversation with Bob Poole. Bob is the Director of Transportation Policy and the Searle Freedom Trust Transportation Fellow at the Reason Foundation, a public policy think tank. We often have guests who can set the stage on what has worked and what hasn't worked in aviation through the years, the economics of aviation, airlines, and airports, as well as providing a perspective on how airlines and others make decisions on what and how and why technology and aircraft are purchased. A deep understanding of this history, buying process, rivers of cash unleashed, and overall how technology decisions are made help to explain why some technology will be purchased quickly and flourish, while other technology and vehicles, although at first glance sound and look exciting and perhaps may appeal to the airline valuations, don't stand the test of time. Let's face it, introducing tech to aviation is hard, and there's a reason for it. Today, we hear from Bob Poole, a respected transportation expert, as he provides a deep dive into airports and the pros and cons of privatizing airports. With many of our guests, we've discussed why airlines and airports in the U.S. are different in their buying processes, even for technology versus others throughout the world. Listen to Bob's conversation and you'll start to understand why. We discuss why the U.S. is an outlier on airport privatization, what U.S. law and FAA regulation allow regarding airport privatization, about the performance of privatized airports globally, and an interesting conversation on what U.S. airports might be worth to owners if long-term leased. To really understand the value of your technologies or innovative vehicle technology, you have to thoroughly understand the economics of your customers. So today's discussion will be well worth your time and study. Bob, thanks for joining us. And to our guests, we hope you enjoy our talk with Bob Poole as you thoughtfully and profitably innovate in the vertical space.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by UAvionics. UAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let UAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Bob Poole is Director of Transportation Policy and the Searle Freedom Trust Transportation Fellow at the Reason Foundation, a public policy think tank based in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. He was among the first to propose the commercialization of the U.S. air traffic control system, and his work in the field helped shape proposals for a U.S. ATC corporation. A version of his nonprofit corporation concept was implemented in Canada in 1996. He has advised the Office of the Secretary of Transportation, the White House Office of Policy Development, and the National Performance Review, the National Economic Council, and the National Civil Aviation Review Commission on ATC commercialization. He is a member of the Air Traffic Control Association and of the GAO's National Aviation Studies Advisory Panel. In 2012 and 13, he was member of the Business Roundtable Task Force on ATC Reform, and in 14 and 15, he was part of the Center for Transportation Working Group on ATC Reform. In 2018, he received the Inno Center's Thought Leadership Award for his work on ATC corporatization. Bob's recent studies helped launch a national debate on air traffic privatization in the United States. He advised both the FAA and local officials during the 89 and 90 controversy over the proposed privatization of Albany Airport. His policy research on this issue helped inspire the privatization of Indianapolis Airport management under Mayor Steve Goldsmith and Congress's 96 enactment of the airport privatization pilot program. In aviation security, Bob advised the White House and House Republican leaders on what became the Aviation Transportation Security Act of '01, enacted in response to the 9/11 attacks. He has authorized a number of recent policy studies on aviation security and is the author of a paper on risk-based aviation security with the OECD's International Transport Forum. Bob has testified on airports, aviation security, and air traffic control on a number of occasions before the House and Senate Aviation and Homeland Security subcommittees, and he has spoken on these subjects before numerous conferences. He has also done consulting work on several airport privatization feasibility studies. Bob also edits a monthly Reason Foundation e-newsletter on aviation policy issues. He received his BS and MS in mechanical engineering at MIT and did graduate work in operations research at NYU. Bob, it's a great pleasure to have you join us on the Vertical Space. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So, Bob, before I ask you the first question, which we ask everybody, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on? And I have a feeling you're going to be able to answer this question better than most.
There are probably several.
I first wanted to give some context to our audience on why we're having this discussion today. We have a lot of innovators and entrepreneurs on the call who are creating capabilities that will eventually be sold to airlines and in some cases airports throughout the world. And as they do, we felt it was important to discuss how the money flows into and within airlines and airports. And as such, many of the topics we'll be discussing today, we believe, will be very important to understand. And you're considered a real expert on many of these topics. So it's a great honor to have you join us. So getting back to our first question, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
I think certainly one of the issues that I have not succeeded in popularizing is variable runway pricing, sometimes called congestion pricing. During the George W. Bush administration, Secretary of Transportation Mary Peters actually changed the federal law, and it was upheld in a court case that airports may do this, but not a single U.S. airport has taken the opportunity to do it. And I think particularly at places like the New York airports, where they have a chronic problem of more airlines wanting to use their runways than there is space for. Pricing is the obvious way to do that. And I did a paper on this with a guy who's a good modeler in 2007. It got a little bit of publicity, but nobody's taken it serious.
Bob, first of all, I did not know that about you. Think about everybody's trying to shoot for the same runways in many cases, especially based on time of day, week, time of year, right?
Yeah, and actually the FAA and the consulting firm did a war game exercise where they had airline schedulers and airport people work on, I think it was LaGuardia Airport, as a case study. And they put them through the paces of if all of a sudden a pricing scheme were implemented and they got the airport people to say, this is sort of how we could do it. What would the airline scheduler's response be? And the prediction was there'd be upgauging. You'd have a lot fewer, 30 passenger, 50 passenger planes. This would reduce the number, but not reduce the passengers or the revenue in general, revenue to the airlines. And so this seemed like this was obvious, good economic solution, but nobody has gotten anywhere close in this country to try it. There's a little bit of congestion pricing at Heathrow. It's not super variable. It's, rush hour and non-rush hour or something. But that's the only case I actually know of. And I keep looking.
I'm going to lean in a little bit here. We've talked a little bit with some guests about congestion and how do you address congestion. And we've talked about New York is responsible for arguably 70 to 80% of the delays in the United States, the New York airports. So how much could your idea affect congestion? I mean, was that the primary purpose?
Yeah. The primary purpose was to reduce or basically eliminate, to match the demand with the actual runway capacity. And the capacity can improve over time with technology, certainly. But at any given point in time, it is what it is. And it's a terrible thing to have that congestion. Now, there's also congestion in the New York region is partly due to air traffic control as well, which I've written a lot about. And the FAA is attempting to deal with that by having moved the Newark and the other New Jersey airports to the Philadelphia TRACON instead. And it's having some teething troubles, but I think that is going to make a significant difference as it gets settled down and the controllers who moved get fully up to speed on doing it out of the Newark TRACON.
What about weather? To what extent does weather cause congestion? And I'm thinking about this dynamic
Yeah.
pricing relative to the timelines.
Yeah, pricing's not going to, it can't change the weather, and blizzards and wind shear from storms and things are going to be there, and you will have stand downs or, FAA programs to slow things down because of weather. I think nobody's going to get around that.
Do you know how much weather contributes to congestion?
I've never seen an estimate. There probably is in the literature some estimates along those lines, and it was wintertime thing. In summer, I hate to go through DFW because of thunderstorms and things. You never know when you're going to get in or when you're going to get out.
Thinking about the dynamic pricing model in terrestrial use cases, like hailing a ride, where the payment and the consumption of the ride happens in short succession, that makes sense. But I'm trying to think through the situation where somebody buys a ticket a few months ahead of time, and then the schedules are made 45 days or maybe even longer ahead of time. You
Yeah,
might
yeah,
not even know what the congestion situation will be at the time of the actual flight. How difficult is it to execute this idea in practice?
Well, it's not the same as express toll lanes on the freeway, where you can do it minute by minute, and you never know from one day to the next what the peak price is going to be. No, the scheme that the FAA study modeled in those war game exercises, it would be fixed for the given schedule period. So the set of prices would change about 3 or 4 times a year and be published in advance. So unless you made your reservation a year in advance, you might not know exactly what that's going to be. And airlines, I think, would have to absorb that cost. I mean, it would be built into the fares within the period of where the pricing is in effect. But if you buy a ticket a year in advance, would have no way to know what increment to the price that would be.
Well, Bob, just playing this out a little further, if you implemented dynamic pricing and it was done in such a way that it would encourage upgauging of
Right.
the aircraft, okay, but what about flights from smaller cities that can't support the upgauging? Is that really going to achieve the objective?
That's the objection that was raised, and I didn't have a good answer to that, other than that there's upgauging has been going on with the regional airlines to some extent, larger jets and the latest Embraer models and so forth. So that is partly being helped by changes in aircraft designs. And, we still have scope clauses that limit what some airlines can do because of the pilot unions, but I think that is at least helping the situation. And I would hesitate. I think if you start having carve outs for certain categories of planes, you're going to really undercut the power or the value of the runway pricing. So, but there's tough trade offs there that would have to be addressed in any real implementation.
I mean, you could make the pricing mechanism more complicated and you could factor in the population of the MSA that people are flying from relative to the number of passengers traveling. And you could go into the math with that. I don't know if you would end up in a better place or not with it.
But the problem is, I think the effect that you want to have on limiting the demand to the runway capacity would be
Right.
reduced by doing those kinds of things. So it wouldn't have as much effectiveness.
I mean, if your objective is getting the most people through the airport per day, period.
And having as little congestion as possible
Right.
on a regular basis, other than weather and air traffic problems.
I mean, is it conceivable that in addition to having a landing fee, let's say in an airport, you have an airport fee and a runway fee?
Well, I prefer to see it as a better landing fee, and the money would somewhat increase the airport's funding base.
So, Bob, your contrarian opinion is what, that congestion pricing should be implemented?
It's that it should be implemented at airports that have not enough runway capacity and no real way to improve the physical amount of runway space, which is certainly true of the three major New York airports, to the best of my knowledge.
Are there analogs in other forms of transportation?
Well, we certainly have congestion pricing in a growing number of metro areas on special lanes on freeways that are growing rapidly. I cover a lot of surface transportation as well. And I actually originated, believe it or not, the idea of express toll lanes added to freeways or converting the carpool lanes to express toll lanes. This is back in a paper in, God, what year was it? 1987, I think it was. And California DOT, which I helped them implement the first one in Orange County, California, that opened in December 1995. And there are now over 60 of these animals out there on American freeways, suburban systems in a lot of major metro areas.
Wasn't New York recently supposed to be implementing congestion pricing?
On
Yeah.
Manhattan, lower Manhattan, well, Manhattan below 60th, I think. And the governor got cold feet and withdrew the proposal she had already approved, fearing that members of Congress from New York who had in the legislature, members of her legislature who voted in favor of it might not get reelected this fall. I mean, I think that was the speculation, at least, of why she did that. But there was a news item today saying that she's going to come up with a new plan by the end of the
Hmm.
year because the MTA needs the money.
Right. Bob, getting back to our the topic at hand.
Right, right.
Talk a
Okay.
little bit about airport privatization. What is it? Why is it popular in other locations and not here?
Well, first of all, what it is, it started out with the UK when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister, and they actually sold shares, 100% of British Airports Authority and a number of other utilities, the government-owned electric company, water company, channel, what do you call it, hovercraft. I don't know if those exist any longer, but there was a whole long raft of these. And several other European countries, I believe Denmark with Copenhagen Airport, and several others also did outright sale, either by finding a private sector buyer to take a majority and the government would keep a minority, or through a stock market offer like Margaret Thatcher had. But that is no longer the main mechanism around the world today, including in the European countries that did it later on, and in Latin America and in Australia, is a long-term lease, long-term public-private partnership lease, which can range from 40 years in San Juan, which is the only active U.S. case done through the federal program, at least, and it's the case in Australia, really took the lead in doing this. A 50-year initial term in those agreements in all the major Australian airports, but they also have an option to renew for 49 years. I don't know what the terms are of, who can call the shots, but the long-term P3 is the only form of airport privatization that is allowed by federal law in this country. And I think it's a pretty good legal framework. There's some limitations to it that have made it difficult. One example of that is that airport tax exempt revenue bonds must be paid off in the event of a significant change in control. And the current aviation thinking is that a 50-year airport lease would be such a change, and so the existing bonds would have to be paid off. And that, being one way or another, it means that the owner of the airport would not get the full gross value. And these typically, in most of these situations around the world, the whole lease value representing in most countries the gross market value of the airport gets paid up front as a huge windfall. In San Juan, they paid 50% upfront and the other 50% in annual lease payments over the 40-year term of the agreement. But almost everywhere else, it's upfront payment. And so the potential for airport owners to have a huge windfall would be there, but it wouldn't be as large as the windfalls received in, you name it, Latin American country or any places in Asia, Philippines, for example, Manila airport P3s. These are almost all long-term leases, and they're the owners of the airport get basically the market value of the airport as determined by what investment people do. They use earnings before interest, taxations, and dividends, called EBITDA, and they calculate a multiple of that as a way to get the market value. And so that's more details than your listeners probably want to hear, but that's how this all goes. Congress started about 20 years ago with an airport privatization pilot program that had one initial taker. Stewart Airport was sold by New York State, but the company that bought it didn't do very well, and they wanted out. And so the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey bought it from them, and it went back into the public sector. San Juan was long term leased under a slightly improved, amended version of that airport privatization pilot program. But in 2018 or 2019, Congress made a big modification, a big improvement, in my view. It's now called the Airport Investment Partnership Program. Unlike the earlier programs, which were limited to 5 or 10 airports and only certain categories of airports, this one applies to all U.S. commercial airports. So any, whether large, medium, or small airport whose owner wanted to do this, they have to apply to the FAA and get approval and so forth, which FAA has a usual bureaucratic procedure and probably takes a year or two to get approval. But if they really want to do that, that is the way to go. And St. Louis tried that in 2019 and had tremendous interest. They sent out a request for qualifications, and 18 companies assembled teams, typically an infrastructure investment fund and an airport company and maybe a pension fund. And of the 18, they selected 12, which is a huge number, to come and give presentations. And people that I knew who were involved in that said they were very credible teams. The airlines attended those presentations and had worked up and got sort of back of the envelope, at least, agreement on how the airport charges would be structured, modeled after the programs that were agreed to in the 2 attempts to lease Midway Airport under the previous program, both of which failed. But the airport, that broke through for the airlines. And ever since then, each time an airport has come up and was serious about going through the program, the companies wanting to bid on it understand what it takes to get the airlines on board. And the airlines have a veto. They have to 65% approval in order for the deal to go forward. So that's no longer a problem. U.S. airlines now understand, here's the formula, and the companies that want to lease airports understand this is the kind of pricing deal we need to reach with the airlines to get them on board and have them be supportive of the deal.
Terrific. Thank you for the introduction. Talk about what's the benefits of privatization to the different constituencies.
Sure. Well, the best way to understand that is to look at the research that's been done. And there's 2 papers that were detailed empirical studies, one done by ICF and Oxford Economics in 22, and it was commissioned by ACI, Airport Council International, the world body. And that study focused on a phenomenon that occurred only really over the last 10 or 12 years of airport groups. These are companies that own multiple airports. Their objective is to build a portfolio of airports and have economies of scale in purchasing, have standardized best practices that get applied, obviously locally tailored to each of the airports, and have career paths for executives that they train at their smaller airports and they are available when openings come up at the bigger airports and so forth. So they get economies of scale and they realize cost savings. And that was the ICF and Oxford Economics study documented those benefits. A more comprehensive study is National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. They commission working papers all the time, and working paper 30544 is about the performance of privatized airports worldwide. It came out in 2023, so it's only a year old, and I've seen it cited all over the place since it came out. They found that there were large performance improvements. They matched a set of conventionally managed airports with privately managed airports under long-term agreements. And they found higher productivity in the privatized airports, more airline service, and increased airline competition, which I was surprised. I think a lot of people were probably surprised at hearing that. And a few specific findings, if you average things over the two sets of privatized and non privatized, the privatized airports had 21% more passengers per flight. I guess upgauging must have taken place at these airports. They generally have deregulated airport pricing. Now, it's about a year since I read this study. I can't remember exactly what that means, but there may have been government restraints on how the pricing could be, and that has become more flexible. I don't know of any that's done congestion pricing, which is one of the things I would hope to see. And generally, the terminals have expanded more in over whatever the time period they looked at. There are more airlines, especially more entry by low cost carriers, and more routes, more points you can get to from those airports, again, on a matched set basis. And the use of global best practices and more experienced managers. So that's pretty powerful. You would have to go through in much more detail than I did in just reading the summary. But if those numbers are really soundly based, and I suspect because NBE are working, they're working papers, but they get critical peer review. And I guess at some point they stop being working papers and become final papers. And if that has not happened with this paper yet, to the best of my knowledge, but it looks like pretty powerful benefits. And I see this as basically converting airports that are run okay by city or county or state governments, but not becoming real businesses with the kind of dynamism and getting the most value out of the assets and being both more customer friendly in terms of the things that are amenities in the airport, but also more airline friendly by making it attractive for more airlines to serve the airport. And there was one anecdote in that study that I remember, that some of the privatized airports formerly had still a national flag carrier that got special privileges, and that gets wiped out. That's one of the conditions, apparently, of doing the lease of the airport, is that you don't give special treatment to a single carrier like that, and that can open things up to more entry and more points served and this kind of thing too.
Talk a little bit about, if you could, how common privatized airports are in different parts of the world. It's a lot more
Yes,
common
and
than
this
most
is
people
this is
realize.
just astonishing. The ACI has pulled together the data on this, and these data are a couple of years old, but I think it probably hasn't changed that much. And the way they report it as the fraction of all passengers in that country that are served by privatized airports, and aggregating that over in Europe, 75% of airline passengers are served by privatized airports in Europe across. Well, so a few countries haven't privatized, but the large ones have all, and so that adds up to a lot of passengers. Latin America and the Caribbean, 66%. And this has been going on. Latin American privatizations have not gotten very much publicity in this country, but I've been watching them and tracking them for years. And all the largest airports in all but Mexico City, for example, in Mexico, of the large significant ones, like Cancun and others, have been long-term leased. Asia Pacific, it's 47%. That includes Australia and New Zealand as among the pioneers, but also individual airports in places like the Philippines and Malaysia. I think that's sort of quasi-private. I'm not sure how that was categorized. Mid East, it's 18%. They're relatively new to this. Africa, 11%, and that South Africa is probably counts for most of that because they privatized about 15, 20 years ago. North America, 1%, and that's accounted for basically by San Juan. So it's a pretty dramatic difference between the United States and our peer countries, let's say, around the world.
So, what parts of the task of running an airport are handled by the owner of the airport? I mean, if you think about,
Yeah, it's as I say, that it's a long-term lease. It's a public-private partnership, legally, technically. So the airport is not only the owner, it's also the public partner. They negotiate a long-term agreement that 40, 50, in a few cases 99 years, and so the airport owner becomes the regulator. They put in presumably performance measures, things that are requirements that they have to do in order to be in good standing under the lease. And any of these long-term leases, I know this better from the surface transport, highways and things, there's always termination clauses, usually two kinds: termination for cause, egregious long-term failure to live up to the agreement. That's it. They can yank the concession, and whatever they put in, they can't particularly recover. But termination for convenience is also in most of these long-term agreements, and there they have to compensate. So they've built in a formula of how they will decide on the value that's owed at any point in the long period. And so that is designed basically to have everybody able to work to an understandable, these are the terms you sign up to on both sides of the table. And I think, of course, the airport is also still entirely regulated by FAA in terms of safety and other things. FAA had not approved as exemptions to normal airport regulations. So there's two levels of regulation, or two and a half, if FAA is having some kinds of performance or requirements, and of course the safety regulation. And then the owner itself, as the public partner, has a significant ongoing regulatory role governed by that long term.
The question I'm asking is, for our audience to understand what are the activities involved in, quote, running an airport, and which of those activities are handled by the airlines, which of those activities are handled by the people who run the concessions at the airport, which of
Right,
the activities
right.
are handled by, in the United States, the TSA, which of the activities are handled by the ground service contractors, and then
Yeah,
which
most of
of
those
these are
things
handled by the
would be
quote airport management?
TSA. You can't get rid of TSA unless, and there is still a program that I forget what its name is, that has about 20 airports that are allowed to by TSA to contract with private security
Yeah, but,
companies that
but where
meet
my question
TSA
is
requirements.
going is
Yeah,
if you create a public-private partnership for an
right.
airport, let's say in the United States, because that's what we've
Hmm.
been using as the picture here, and then that airport starts charging passenger usage fees, like what we see at Heathrow or airports in
Hmm.
Europe, what does the passenger get in return for that? If the airline is already doing certain activities and the TSA is already doing certain activities, what parts of the quote airport management that the passenger is now paying a fee for, what's going to change? What are they going to see in terms of a benefit?
I don't the AIPP, the legislation that allows long-term leases, does not exempt an airport from the constraints of the passenger facility charge legislation. That same PFC legislation would apply to the P3 airport. So the airport could not do a Heathrow
Okay.
and charge an additional passenger fee by that, unless the federal law were changed. So that's one thing they could not do. Now they obviously can negotiate with rental car companies to have maybe some differences in the arrangements there. I mean, a lot of airports today are putting in consolidated rental car centers and charging if they're financing it off the airport's balance sheet, they're financing it, having the private firm allowing it to charge a per day rental car additional fee. That's the revenue source for building and operating and maintaining the consolidated rental car center. So that kind of thing you'd probably see more of if a P3 airport company running the airport. I think all the regular operational decisions, negotiating with airlines, deciding which vendors, who would manage the concessions. We certainly saw when BAA was privatized, it really radically improved the airport concessions at the BAA airports. And they set up a BAA USA in hopes of at least, and they actually got concession management at Pittsburgh for an initial term. They may have done it at Indianapolis for 10 years or something. So there's a lot of things that the current the city or county government that owns the airport does now that would become the province of the airport company that has the long-term agreement. Anything that's commercial, they would want to be in charge of in order to have the relationship that they think works best with their airlines and that works best with managing the concessions and in the retail and so forth in the airport and rental car and all those things. I would think they probably would not try to get an exception from TSA to be in the private security space, but that remains to be seen. They might try to do that because that program does exist. Typically today, U.S. airports that didn't already do this 20 years ago, because once TSA got its staff unionized, any airport, Sacramento wanted to do this, and the unions ran a campaign against the elected officials, vowing that they would not get reelected if they went through with this. And Sacramento government caved in, and that was an object lesson for other airports that would. But there's been very few attempts by a medium or large airport to opt out of TSA provision since the unionization of the TSA staff.
Bob, I'm still trying to figure out what really is the benefit to the average passenger if they are traveling through a privatized
That's what I
airport.
don't get.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and I'll take me as an example. I don't really care whether my favorite restaurant is in the
Right.
airport or if my favorite coffee shop is there. I just want to get on the plane as efficiently as possible. And back to Peter's point, that is really not in the control of the airport owner. There's other parties involved, TSA, airlines, et cetera.
Right,
So,
right.
so as a passenger, I can expect higher prices perhaps for the rental that I'm getting or the occasional coffee that I'm getting. But what do I get in return?
Well, I think one thing you get based on the most recent study, you would probably have more destinations reachable from that airport over time, because that's the kind of thing that the P3 airports around the world are accomplishing. And if your favorite airport doesn't is not served by a low cost carrier, they seem to be motivated to open that up and manage to not be cowed by their established incumbent airlines to do that. Now, of course, they're willing to spend money on expanding the terminals, certainly where that's feasible, to accommodate a larger number of destinations and a larger number of airlines. That's not going to work everywhere.
Why is that the case? Why are airlines more likely to fly into a privatized airport?
I'm not sure, but certainly low cost carriers have had difficulty to some extent in getting into a number of airports. I mean, they seem to be making slow progress, but ones I hate to use. I was going to use Atlanta as an example, but now Southwest is there. I'm not sure if Frontier or Spirit has managed to get in there. I mean, this is not something that I track very rigorously, but I think that is something that we see worldwide as something that the airport companies want to do, is to have as broad a range of airline choices and as broad a number of destinations that you could get to from that airport.
Bob, you're saying that they tend to release the stranglehold of a very large airline on the airport. If that's the case, I'm guessing more gates would be made available to other airlines. And if more gates are made available, those other airlines will take those gates.
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I would love to see some actual case studies that were in the NBER study to figure out how did they do this in various airports to break the hold of a dominant carrier and open things up. Certainly, long-term airline use agreements. One of the things that has gotten U.S. airlines thus far on board with the proposed, actual San Juan and proposed St. Louis and Midway is certainty over a fairly long period of time of what the landing fees and other fees are going to be. That was seemed to be the real deal maker in getting, and that model has been adapted each time there's a serious effort to do an airport P3.
Based on your answer to Luca's question, what's come of prices to passengers based on what you're saying? I have a feeling I know where they went. Luca's asking, what's the benefit to the passenger of the privatization? What's happened
Right.
to the airline pricing?
I don't know the answer to that. It probably is somewhere in the NBER study, but the document that I read, which is a like 50-page, that is the report. I'm sure there's backup materials, but I have not seen any of the backup materials, so I really don't know what has happened to airfares.
But that sounds like a central question.
I think it's a good point. Yeah.
So, Bob, before we get into, we're going to have two groups in a room. We're going to have a group that says we got to do this. And who are those groups? And then we have a group who's going to say this is a horrible idea. So we'll talk about the for and against in a minute. But tell everybody right now, there's going to be a lot of listeners thinking, well, no, we got privatization in our area. There's places like in LaGuardia. There's
Oh, sure.
talk a
Right.
little bit.
Brand, wonderful new
Yeah.
terminals
And
and coming soon to JFK and maybe even
yeah, if
Newark
you have
now.
not been to LaGuardia Airport, oh my, I mean, it's one
Oh,
of the
if
greatest
I was just blown
experiences you'll
away,
ever see.
blown
Blown away. And
away.
that's a management company. I assume parts of that are
Yeah.
privatized. But let me ask this question. We're talking about complete privatization of the airport here.
Yeah.
Talk about where in the US, where some parts of the airport are privatized.
Rental car centers, new cargo facilities, potentially an airport hotel, and definitely a terminal P3 or several, depending, as in the case of JFK, there's three going on now, worth about, I think, 15 billion or something total investment in those. So component privatization is catching on. It was one fiasco at Denver when between the airport and the company there was not a meeting of minds, and they terminated it after about a year. But the others seem to have gone very well, and this seems to be a trend that will continue, and that no changes in law are needed. It's simply a case of if a big project that requires it has to be financed can be done off of the airport's balance sheet, which is the case with revenue financed P3s, which are the three terminals at JFK and the LaGuardia existing one at LaGuardia, and the rental car center at LAX. No, the rental car center at Newark, but not the rental car center P3 at LAX. So the off balance sheet financing can be attractive to an airport depending on what its overall balance sheet looks like. And so a number of these component privatizations are financed that way by the P3 entity. But there has to be a revenue stream that's tappable for that. And it might be a new revenue stream that wasn't there before.
I was about to say, for those who question the value of the privatization of the airports, go to Europe and see those airports, and then come to the United States and see ours. But there's a little bit of a
Uh-huh.
change that's occurred. LaGuardia being one of the best examples.
At the same time, being from Europe, I hate the idea of being a general aviation pilot and having to pay every time my wheels touch the ground at
Uh-huh.
most European airports. So I don't know, Bob, if you're a pilot as well, but what are the impacts of waves of privatization of airports to general aviation?
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm not a private pilot. I have flown with friends who are, and actually learned how to do coordinated turns and so forth. But I've never had the time or money earlier on, and the time later on to try to get into that myself. No, I read a lot of GA things, and I know that the USGA community was very concerned and very opposed to air traffic control corporatization, which would have been not a private company, but it would have been a new kind of entity separate from the FAA. And there were huge battles fought over two separate bills. The second one was much better, had been revised with inputs from me and several members of the House Transportation Committee who were themselves private pilots. And the opposition, it did not make one whit of difference with the orchestrated campaign by NBAA and AOPA to make sure this didn't happen. I understand the concerns about this. I don't think U.S. aviation law, I'm speculating here, would allow a situation where GA aircraft would get charged outrageous fees at P3 airports. Now, that may be blue sky, wishful thinking, but I mean, U.S. has always been different in terms of how GA is treated. GA was not in a happy place in Europe even before airport privatization. And in Canada, air traffic control thing, it turns out, really has been accommodating to GA. They are not paying for air traffic services. They pay an annual, in effect, membership fee that is based on the weight of the aircraft. And it's not been an obstacle or a problem. And even the Canadian Business Aircraft Association is on board with NAV Canada and its way of pricing air traffic control. That's not to say anything else about airports, because airports are not the same
Right.
as air traffic
Right.
control. I doubt that it would be seen as a good thing to do for a P3 airport in the United States to start charging GA European type prices.
But Bob, as you say, those are distinctly two different things: the privatization of an airport and privatization of air.
Yeah, no, I
Okay, I
understand. I'm
mean,
just saying, but
yeah,
I understand the lobbying power of general
oh yeah,
aviation in the
oh
United
yeah,
States, which is not repeated in any other country that I know of.
yeah.
And I think GA is likely to be deferred to, and in cases of U.S. airport privatization, I have not heard any complaints about San Juan, which is our big case in point that's been in under a P3 for more than a decade now, has been transformed by the P3. I mean, the before and after is unbelievable. People who used to travel on vacation through that airport nowadays using it come back. It's like a different airport that has modern array of retail and food options that were not there before. It was like something out of the 1950s that had not changed. So I think it has worked very well, but I have never heard anything about what GA aircraft pay there.
So let's say the for and against in the United
Hmm.
States. First of all, who would be most for a mid-sized privatized airport in the United States, and who would be against? And then what are the principal reasons? You've already addressed most of the for. What would be the principal reasons that somebody would be against it? First of all, who are the parties?
Yeah, who are the party? Well, airlines, as I say, are generally on board if you have the same kind of airline pricing formula that's in existence in San Juan that was proposed for and agreed to for Midway in St. Louis and so forth. The airport trade associations have held conferences on this, but until very recently had not taken a position. But the CEO of ACI North America came out a couple of weeks ago in an interview with Aviation Week saying, if we're not going to get a PFC increase for another 5 years, and we've got umpteen billions of capital improvements needed, probably plan B is going to be long-term airport P3 leases, so you get the financing ability of the private sector to cover a lot of the needed capital investments. So that was a sea change. I don't know how far that's going to go. Local governments still, there's not been much interest. I think city, county, and state governments that own and operate airports have been very content with their status quo. And I'm not quite sure. I mean, to some extent, it's always been that way. They're used to it. They also a number of city governments, and I will mention Atlanta and Miami as ones that I know detailed examples, like to micromanage things their airports. And so that is, the micromanagement thing is one thing they have to give up. And the long term P3 agreement, I think, would absolutely not cater to micromanaging little details. That's exactly the kind of things the company wants to be managing and doing. Local, let's see, federal government has been supportive by, the succession of airport P3 programs. And the FAA has been frustrated that there haven't been more applicants to it. The guy who was in charge of it since the outset retired last year with only San Juan to his credit as having been actually in the program and succeeded. New Haven is not being done through the AIPP. It's managed a workaround to do their deal, and so FAA people are frustrated at not. FBOs have never said anything about this, and I don't know what FBOs might say about it. The thing that I think might change airport owners is the potential of a one-time windfall from a large upfront lease payment. And in a report that I did in 2019, I did 31 large and medium hub airports, got data from an FAA database to calculate their most recent EBITDA number, and then looked at average multiples in global airport privatization and made some estimates of value. And I got just a few notes here to find the right page. A net value for LAX after paying off their existing outstanding tax exempt bonds, 10.6 billion. If they didn't have to do that, if the law were changed, it would be 17.8 billion. This again, my 2019 figures. Las Vegas net value 3.4 billion, gross value 7.2. San Jose, 1.3 billion net, 2.5 billion gross. St. Louis, net value 970 million and gross value 1.3 billion.
And Bob, the difference between gross and net is the
The bond, tracking the bond payoff. Yeah. Yeah. And so that, of course, some have a huge amount. Some have, O'Hare has a huge amount, and their numbers came out mostly negative because the debt was larger than at least the net value.
Bob, what's the profitability of US airports in terms of EBITDA percent?
Well, they are all the medium and large are certainly operating in black. Definitely. I can't quote you the EBITDA numbers just off the top of my head. I'd have to, find the report and get them. But I think when we released that report in 2019, no, actually we released it. It was done in 2019. We held off because of the pandemic. We released it in 2021, and we put out tables showing one of the things we did. Reason Foundation's pension team pulled together numbers for each of those airport owners of what its unfunded public sector pension liability was. And most city, county, and state governments do not have fully funded employee retirement systems. They have significant unfunded liabilities. And so we came out with the numbers that, even because we only use the net numbers in that study, even with the net numbers, some of them, 31, a couple dozen, would come close to being able to pay off their unfunded pension liability. And that had no traction whatsoever at the time of the study. Now, maybe if the law were changed and they could get the gross value with the P3 company taking over debt service on the existing bonds, a larger fraction of them would be able to pay off their unfunded liability and then some. Other things they could do, they could, fund other infra. There's a concept that the Australians introduced in the early part of this century called infrastructure asset value recycling. So they would sell or lease a major infrastructure asset and use the proceeds for projects in infrastructure that were needed but were going to be difficult to fund, or would involve taking on a lot of debt to fund, and they could fund them basically with cash from the proceeds from the asset recycling. So that aspect, perhaps we should have emphasized that more in the study. The pension thing didn't really get traction.
Bob, talk a little bit about where the funding comes from for the privatization. There's a couple different entities.
Yes, yeah. The three main providers of the money. The biggest amounts typically comes from a global infrastructure investment fund. And I do an annual report at Reason Foundation looking at the largest 100 of those and how they rank and what their assets under management are and so forth. They look for revenue generating infrastructure, whether it's railroads, electric, gas utilities, airports, seaports, anything that is a business that generates revenue as the kind of things they would like to invest in. But you can't invest, they're investing equity. And a government owned utility or government owned airport has no equity, so you cannot invest in it. Likewise, the second category is public pension funds. It's been a big trend in the last 10 to 15 years, started by pension funds in Canada and Australia, of investing equity to broaden their portfolios in revenue generating infrastructure. And so they can only do that in ones that are privatized if they were formerly government. So they invest in P3 airports, often as part of the team. And the third is airport companies, the global airport companies themselves. They're not as big of money investors as the infrastructure funds or sometimes the pension funds. And you typically, the teams that signed up for St. Louis, most of them included an infrastructure fund, an airport company, and about half of them included at least one major pension fund. So that's where the money
Yeah.
basically comes from. It's equity investment, and then from then on, it's issuing at this point taxable revenue bonds. But we're writing a little brief for the federal surface transportation reauthorization that occurs in 2026, and it's going to start debate next year. There's a tax exempt private activity bonds that Congress legalized about 20 years ago for highways and transit. And a study committee in the House T&I committee about 5 years ago said, well, these should really be expanded so that those kinds of private activity bonds can be applied to airports and seaports as well. So we're going to pick that up and argue for that. And there's currently a federal cap of $30 billion, which is probably going to be used up by highway projects within the next few years. And so instead of arguing for raising the cap another knot, if they expand it to airports and seaports that could then issue privatized ones could issue tax exempt revenue bonds, we would argue to remove the federal cap altogether because there's no federal cap on municipal tax exempt bonds. And once this has become a proven mechanism, why shouldn't it be available? So that there's a chance that that could actually happen in the 2026 surface transportation reauthorization because that committee has jurisdiction over the existing private activity bonds. And it's that same committee in the House that recommended expanding it to airports and seaports. That would be a partial game changer for airport P3s.
Technology spending. Is there any correlation between the amount that airports spend on technology that are privatized versus not privatized?
I haven't seen any data. I can only give you the anecdotes of San Juan. And one of the things that was changed when it was privatized is ancient radar system, things that were actually out of service for several years. I don't know how FAA allowed that to happen, but they were. And they're basically a crash program to bring that technology up to modern standards at San Juan, which is one thing the airlines have, needless to say, loved because it was more reliable flights with all of those things in new technology and working all the time. But I have not seen technology companies taking any interest in U.S. airport P3s to date, partly because it hasn't been that big of an issue. I mean, if a wave of this started happening in the next 5 years, I think the technology companies might see that airport P3 company might be more willing to invest in newer technology sooner because it would please their airline customers
Right.
and make things more reliable and make them easier, have less problems in bad weather and things like that.
So we had a guest on a little while ago that was talking about how they provided gate optimization, better gate turns to the airports.
That's the kind of thing I think they would
Right.
love to have a company that's available from a U.S. company. That would be
Yeah.
a good candidate. It would be politically smart. It wouldn't have to be a European or whatever
So
company.
he mentioned that, that the airports purchasing with the United States are completely different than they are, for example, in Europe. How much of that does privatization play a role, do you think?
I I I know that I recall traveling to London and Paris before airport privatization, and the same general way of arranging of having gates signed late in the boarding process, and you wait and see until 45 minutes before the flight what gate you're going to be at. That seems to have continued after privatization, and it always annoyed me beforehand, but the airports that I've been at least it hasn't changed. Madrid, I think, is still the same after privatization because I've been there several times.
Luca, you were about to ask a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about how to best frame this question, but I'm trying to understand the economics of it because,
Mm-hmm.
on the one hand, we have airlines who are saying we don't mind privatization as long as our fees don't change. Passengers are probably equally excited about not paying more.
Right.
And I think you referenced earlier in the conversation that there are some constraints that even privatized airports cannot increase prices for or
Right. They
fees for
can't do a
passengers.
higher passenger facility charge, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
So, that's on the one hand. On the other hand is this, investment in technology and growth and running things more efficiently, which requires investment, which
Mm-hmm.
asks for a return. So how can you have a cake and eat it too?
Right, right. I think the answer to that is the experience from the NBER study is that the game is to expand the amount of flying, therefore the amount of passengers, the amount of retail sales, not necessarily to jack those prices up to the point. I mean, people, yeah, they're sort of captive for an hour in your airport, but if the prices are very high compared to what they spend on a hamburger elsewhere, that's a discretionary purchase. They're not necessarily going to put up with it if it goes to a silly high price. I think the key is bigger volume, and that's what you really see the data in the NBER study is more airlines, more destinations, some degree of upgauging of the kinds of flights or equipment that the airlines choose to do in the expanded environment. So I think that is, it sounds like, a nice story, but I think there's evidence there. I haven't seen the underlying work papers from the NBER study, so I can't be sure of that. But that seems to be the picture that's drawn, is doing it on larger volume rather than depending largely on big price increases.
Does that mean that airports that are already at capacity are not really good candidates for privatization?
I think that's they'd probably be low on the list of candidates. Like St. Louis was a great opportunity because it has a lot of unused capacity. They built an extra runway that has hardly ever, I don't think it's ever been used, when they thought they were going to be a bigger and bigger hub for TWA or then American, and that proved a fiasco. But yeah, I think your speculation is right that a JFK or Newark is not going to be high on the list of. But on the other hand, the scuttlebutt in the airport P3 industry and the infrastructure investment funds, particularly, is U.S. is the last big untapped market, and I would expect the first deals might pay a little premium to be first in to get a good U.S. airport and make it a showcase for what can be done.
Let's say the CEOs of the big three airlines are on the call right now. Which airports would they, and this may be the same answer you just gave, Bob,
Right,
which
right.
airports are they going to say, we have to do this right now at these airports? And which ones do they say, stay away from?
Well, they would stay away from fortress hubs. Newark, United, Atlanta, Delta, and DFW American, I think, are going to not be high on any airlines list or those airlines list. And they have a good situation and they get what they want. And no, it's hard pressed. I think one certainly with expanding room and the potential for a large drawing on a larger base of being served by regional airlines to bring in more people from a reasonable distance. And there's a lot of mid-sized airports and some larger ones that would meet those criteria. And those would go into the valuation estimate certainly too, because you're going to pay the higher dollar for the ones with the biggest potential. You look at your existing EBITDA, and the multiple that gets applied is going to reflect a lot of what's the growth potential here.
So even the very large airports that are not fortress hubs, but have
Right.
large volume, those could be airports. They would be more apt to support the privatization you're saying.
I think so because there's a lot there to build from. As long as they have room to expand. I mean, runways are going to be a limiting factor at some airports because it simply isn't room to build more. Denver, on the other hand, still has room. Already has a lot of. They're not short by any means of runway capacity, and Dulles, which is not my favorite airport, but it has room to I think they'd add at least one more runway if they ever needed it. Whether that would be a good target or not, I'm not sure. I don't think that would be high on the list, but it's not really my business to make those assessments.
So on the one hand, it's capacity at the airport that allows you to grow. On the other hand, it's a growing population in the city that the airport serves.
Definitely that, and also in let's say a 300 or 400 mile radius that could be reached by regionals as feeders, and maybe even by EVTOLs or something, which I'm still a skeptic of. But you've got to think of the larger catchment area too as a secondary consideration to the
Right.
metro area itself.
The more an airport is apt to be common use is probably a correlation between the likelihood of it being more willing to be privatized.
I agree. Yeah, and that's of course a very common European feature, pretty standard in Europe, not standard here. Although that has been breaking
Yep.
down. Common use has more and more of that as airline agreements are renegotiated for new term. The airports are gaining more control over their space and more ability to use it with flexible gates and things. It's not universal by any means, but it's an ongoing trend, I think, and that would certainly be something that an acquisition under a long-term lease they would certainly want to get to that sooner rather than later.
Something I was reading, I think you mentioned briefly, one of the benefits of having a professional business manager is that if there's a common use gates, for example, I'd like to have a business organization running this.
Absolutely. I'm appalled sometimes that when I'm waiting at Atlanta, sometimes I'm there a few hours ahead and I see a gate blocked off for an arrival, a Delta arrival that's 2.5 hours away. And it's that gate could be in use for other airlines, but oh no, it's Delta's property.
So, okay, the airport privatization pilot program was established in 1997, so 27 years ago. And then it was fixed and amended in 2018, renamed the Airport Investment Partnership
Right.
Program. And over 27 years, we have one airport that has adopted this process. What does that tell you? Has the market spoken that this is not a good idea?
Well, I think it's the airport owners that have spoken that they're uncomfortable with it in general, and I think the case has not been made well enough to them that there could be a lot of benefits. They would not be losing control. I think they still think of this as Margaret Thatcher selling the airport to strangers, and they would have no longer have any say in it. It wouldn't be their airport anymore. If they really understood what a long-term 50-year public-private partnership is and their role in it, and the potential of a large windfall up front that they could use for other things. And that's one of the things. The AIPP allows them to use those proceeds for any legitimate government purpose. The early program, you still the money could only be used on the airport, and that was definitely a deterrent for owners to if they unless they needed additional funding to do things on the airport. There just wasn't a deal that was easily makeable then. Now the AIP makes real global type long-term P3 leases doable. But the question is getting any of the owners to decide, hey, this would be good for us to do. I think it's one of those things. If one or two mainland airports, like if St. Louis had gone through, there was a whole lot of thinking in the global airport industry and among a lot of aviation professionals that there would be followers if they saw that this turned out to be a good deal for airlines and for passengers and for the airport's role in the overall aviation system. But we don't have that demonstration yet on the mainland. We have a good small success story in San Juan, but that's hard to sell 48 states on as something we should do.
Well, you mentioned that the head of ACI North America has said, listen, if I can't get funding from the government, I'm going to turn to potentially to privatizing the airports.
I was flabbergasted by that and very pleased because now how far that goes, whether that's going to influence any airport owners, it may at least start some serious thinking about that. And I'm under contract to a joint venture of American Enterprise Institute and Brookings Institution to do a study that will come out next spring on one or two policy changes that I think could spark a serious or starting of U.S. airport P3s. And it's basically the tax law changes to deal with the tax exempt bond questions. And so the paper, I have a draft written and it hasn't gone through peer review yet, so I'm not sharing it with anybody. But that is in the works, and I hope that it will start serious thinking within the U.S. aviation community and people like the ACI North America CEO. Maybe they'll hold a conference or two, which AAAE did hold airport P3 privatization conferences back when Midway was in play. And I don't think they did another one when St. Louis was going through the process. But so there's been interest by the associations, and I think now that ACI North America has laid down this flag, I think they may start looking at conferences and other things to talk with their members about the financial problems of they bonded all their PFC revenue, and without an increase they can't bond anymore. So there's nothing more to bond.
You mentioned New Haven, and it's right down the road from me. Let's say the privatization took place. What are the local communities? How do they benefit, or why would they be against privatization, or would they just be a neutral party?
I don't think I don't think they would be against it. Certainly, the city government of New Haven has welcomed the idea because they have landed a scheduled airline, Avalo, which they didn't have for a number of years. And so the airport is back in business, serving passengers. That airline is growing. I believe Breeze, competitor, has announced that they're going to be starting some service from New Haven, which would give them a second airline all of a sudden. And so they're proceeding with, and they're doing it. I'm not quite sure how what they haven't needed the AIPP, and FAA has not objected. So there seems to be a way to do this, and a similar non-AIPP thing is underway in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
So, from the standpoint of community and having access to an airline, and yeah, Velo has been terrific for this area.
Uh,
But let's talk a little bit about the issues. What has been the response to noise concerns from privatized airports versus non-privatized? I mean, as we know, those communities can be awfully influential.
oh, believe me, I know that. Yeah, I have not seen any data on that. And of course, we don't have a base of US privatized airports to compare with. And I know the only recent noise controversy, big one that I know of in Europe is Amsterdam Schiphol, where they've tried to, reduce the amount of
Right.
flying on the ground, on the grounds at least, of noise exposure to nearby residents. I mean, practically every airport in the world or in the United States, other than Denver, has noise exposure problems. Maybe the other one in Virginia, but it's goes with the territory. And I think airports have learned to do insulation
Right.
programs and
Right.
things, and they cope the best they can. And a lot of the problem is that an airport is there, and in its early years, the noise exposure is a small amount of land, and as it gets bigger, it applies at more hours, it spreads further. Although to some extent, it actually gets reduced as the aircraft today are dramatically less noisy than the ones of being manufactured 30 and 40 years ago. So part of this is people are more sensitive to it these days.
Right.
But it's a problem that almost every airport has to contend with. And I just haven't seen any data on how privatized airports have dealt with it compared to others.
All right. A delicate question: is there one political party in the United States that tends to prefer or support the privatization of airports versus the other?
Broad generalization on privatization, not specifically airports, because that hasn't really been an issue, but Republicans and conservatives had generally been more open to privatization and P3s. And you see this more in states in the Southwest, Southeast and Southwest. Texas, until recently, had a lot of P3 highway projects. Virginia is full of them. Atlanta Airport, Atlanta Metro Atlanta, Georgia DOT has lots of P3 highway projects. Tennessee, Nashville, and other large metro areas are getting on board with this stuff. As a generalization, conservative and Republican governments have been somewhat more favorable, but you get the current populist trend in the Republican Party is exemplified by Texas, which has gone a completely the governor, the Republican governor and lieutenant governor, both strongly opposed to any more P3s in the highway system in Texas, and anti-toll, very populist. So I can't predict for the future. The next 5 or 10 years, the Republican Party looks to be very different from what it has been the last 40 or 50 years during most of my politically aware lifetime.
And the hugely conservative Connecticut is maybe one of the first airports to go.
This is really, really interesting. Yeah.
Wow. So, as you approach the podcast, you were
Mhm.
probably thinking we were going to ask certain questions. And have we asked the questions you want us to ask? And is there anything else we haven't
I,
asked that you'd like to talk about?
well, one you didn't ask, and it was kind of trivial to answer, is possible risks to investors in airport P3s, and they're the same kind of risks practically in any business. Below forecast revenues. I mean, you have a big recession or a pandemic, and you're taking a risk that your revenue goes way downhill. And this has happened to a couple of P3 toll road leases in the United States. Both the Indiana Toll Road and the Chicago Skyway were leased, one case for 75 years, the other for 99 years, a big upfront payment. And when the financial markets collapse happened about a decade ago, both of them declared Chapter 11 and were bought out by pension funds. paid much higher cash up front and much less aggressive financing and are doing fine running them these days. But that's certainly a risk in any kind of long-term revenue financed P3. Early termination of a long-term agreement, if you run things well, that's not likely to happen. But once in a while, we just have seen in Texas a termination for convenience of a less than 10-year-old 50-year highway P3, where the company invested about $1.5 billion in putting in express toll lanes, but they didn't do a very good job with their termination for convenience clause. They've had hard dollar numbers in 5-year increments, and the state DOT and some legislators who don't like P3s looked at that carefully and said they looked at its probable market value because it's done very well and it's fast growing. Market value was a couple hundred million higher than what the buyout price was, as if they did it this year, and so they did it.
Right.
They terminated for convenience and paid the price that they had to pay in the agreement, but they made a several $100 million profit on the deal, and they now can micromanage it the way they would like to micromanage.
How do you see the airport community changing in the next 10 years in the United States?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think we will see a few major airport P3 leases, like San Juan, actually going forward, partly for the reasons that ACI in North America has cited. But I don't think we're going to see a PFC increase even in the next FAA reauthorization 5 years from now. And certainly, if that's the case, I think even before then, we may see a few take place. And I think a few, is going to sort of normalize the idea. It's no longer going to be this weird thing that only the people in Puerto Rico would do. At a mainstream airports, it's now okay to do, and particularly if the airlines are happy and the customers are happy, that hasn't been charging them an arm and a leg to do things they used to do at low cost. And yeah, I think we'll see that. I think we're going to see a little bit of movement on the air traffic control system. And I've started talking about it as there's several steps that could be taken separately. The first important step would be to separate the FAA's air traffic organization organizationally from the safety regulatory body of FAA. That has been ICAO policy since 2001, and all over the world, almost everybody has done it except France and the United States. And it really should be done. It's a basic good government principles, because FAA, as a safety regulator, is basically regulating itself when it regulates air traffic control. Those should be at arm's length. And I think that one change might actually be doable in the next 5 years, certainly within the next 10 years. It may not go past that at that point in time. And I think we eventually will join the global trend. Over 60 governments have privatized or corporatized their air traffic systems, taken it out of the government transport ministry, put it at arm's length, safety regulated at arm's length. Those are mostly government corporations with, say, typically a transportation minister or a commerce minister as the sole shareholder. Not my ideal, but it definitely makes them somewhat more businesslike. And there's also, when you add up the number of countries, because there's two multi-country organizations that do air traffic control for about 6 or 7 Central American countries and about 12 African countries. So over 80 countries have a corporate entity of some sort running air traffic control separated from government safety regulations. So that's the global trend, and I think eventually we will join it.
And Monty Brewer was talking about some of the benefits of it in his discussion, the former CEO of Air Canada. Any other advice to our entrepreneurs, our business leaders, our innovators?
I think as you mentioned, the tech industry would probably stand to gain from a more businesslike, aggressive pursuit of improvements to the airport technology sooner rather than later, because it would help the business case going forward. So that would help. I think there's real potential in the airport community if ACI North America starts making a big deal out of this, which I hope they do. And I would be glad to speak at a conference or two.
Great. Bob, can't thank you enough for joining us. It's been terrific talking with you and reconnecting, and all the best. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.